like what you learn from Amazon is never as clear as when you start doing it outside of Amazon. You sort of realize all these things that you learn through it and how valuable they might be. And for me, I think there's a lot of those. But I think the biggest thing that I think it's driving me right now, and that I think I'm considering it to be a very valuable part of my toolkit, is sort of this idea of single credit ownership that I think is very, very, very Amazon.
Welcome to the Think Like Amazon podcast. This is your backstage pass into the principles and processes that have powered one of the world's most influential companies. I am Jorge Luis Pando. I'm an 8-year former Amazonian with a passion for helping ambitious professionals grow their careers in a way that's both balanced and sustainable. Each episode, I will talk to leaders to uncover the insights behind their success, and more importantly, how you can apply them to grow your own career. If you're ready to think bigger, move faster, and build a lasting impact, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. So happy to be back with Luis Caballero as our guest for this episode. Luis spent over 11 years at Amazon. His experience was very broad. He went to Amazon straight out of business school. He went into product management and then moved to vendor management, to marketing, and then back to product and leading technical teams. So a very broad experience. He was also the president of Latinos at Amazon. He had the chance to represent, he's originally from Venezuela, had the chance to represent all of Amazon's Latinos, which is a very big responsibility. And as well, he, as I remember correctly, he hosted even a marketing podcast within Amazon. So a lot of extracurricular activities that he had on top of his regular job. And today, he is the VP of Marketing Strategy and Analytics at HelloFresh. So Luis, welcome to this episode of the podcast. I'm so happy again to have you here. I'm going to start off with a question that I love asking all former Amazonians, and that is, tell us about that number one skill that you acquired at Amazon and that you've taken with you beyond your time at Amazon. And I'm curious just to learn, what was that skill for you?
Oh, yes, thank you, Jorge, and thanks for inviting me. I'm super happy to be here. I'm excited that you're doing this, and I'm excited to share whatever experience might be valuable to your listeners. And so happy to be here. There's a lot, I think, so as you mentioned, I started this new gig about 18 months ago, and so it's never as, what you learn from Amazon is never as clear as when you start doing it outside of Amazon. You sort of realize all these things that you learn through it and how valuable they might be. And for me, I think there's a lot of those. But I think the biggest thing that I think it's driving me right now, and that I think I'm considering it to be a very valuable part of my toolkit, is sort of this idea of single credit ownership that I think is very, very, very Amazon. I think a lot of people, anyone who's at Amazon, I think would recognize the term. It's actually not that easy to explain to folks that haven't been there, but it's this notion of sort of empowering leaders with the research, the very clear purpose of something that's important to fix, and then the resources around what is needed to fix it with as much ownership as possible so they can go super fast and get them done. And the reason why that matters to me, or that it's been a big deal for me, is that I currently lead a team that is similar to the last one that I used to lead in Amazon, which is a team of data scientists and analysts, and it's really a cross-functional team of analytics that includes data engineering and includes data science and machine learning. Really, my background doesn't have a lot to do with science or even engineering. And the reason why I'm in this position is because sort of at some point, somebody at Amazon sort of believed that I could take one of these sort of single threaded roles that are very focused on that. To give you the full quick version of my trajectory, as you mentioned, I came to the US to do a business degree in Boston. Before that, I was doing marketing in a telecom operator back at home. I'm from Caracas, Venezuela. And once I got out of business school, Amazon hired me, and I was in this rotational program. And then they were like, okay, where do you want to go as the first step? And I was like, well, marketing, because it will be comfortable and interesting. And when they threw me in there, I found myself in this team that was me, maybe another marketing person, and 9 software engineers. And I was like, what's up? I thought I was going to be in this comfortable role similar to the one that I had before business school, where I was working with marketing people and maybe some creative folks, and we were trying to kind of figure out some strategies. And yet, like, the environment was very much a very highly technical group. That what they were trying to do, it was marketing. It was creating marketing experiences, but through technology. It was this team that managed Amazon's integrations with Google to create search traffic from Google into Amazon. And the way that they used to do that, which is now the way that most companies do it, is through integrating with Google through APIs. This is like highly automated way of doing it, but it's very much marketing. It's like mapping somebody who's looking for a specific product to the type of offers Amazon has. And the way that you do that is creating technologies and integrations, and then eventually sort of data science models to be able to optimize that experience. But it was in an environment where there was all this technical folks that like was very, very foreign to me as somebody that had some marketing experience. And Jorge, to be honest with you, I loved it. Like, it was like an amazing 2 years. Like, I learned a ton about sort of technical aspects of the job. I learned about like how do you actually empower yourself to use technology to create marketing experience, how you can sort of create this sort of this balance between the right and the left side of the brain to create something that's really powerful and compelling, but by using analytics and technology. And so that shaped the rest of my career. I did, like, as I mentioned, some vendor manager roles. I didn't go super well. It wasn't great for me. There's ups and downs in all of these journeys. And then I did a similar role on social media, which is kind of similar, creating a data science model to kind of aid the way that you create social media. Eventually, I was sort of the guy that was in these marketing teams, and I was going back to central analytics teams and asking them to fix the way that we measure things, because I felt that we weren't measuring them good enough. And then the guy was running that team was called customer behavior analytics. And so the leader of that at some point was like, listen, like, how about you stop complaining and come help us out? And so I took a product role with that group. And then eventually that product, we found some opportunities to sort of evolve our analytics solutions. And that created at some point this opportunity to say, like, we have this very, very hard problem. We know that the way to fix that is through empowering a team to just fix it and have a single threaded leader that can lead that team to sort of go after that problem in a relatively narrow way. Let's empower that person with the right resources to be able to fix it. It doesn't matter what resources they are. If they're scientists or engineers or the product people, it doesn't matter who they are. Let's go and create a team that goes fix that, put it under a single threaded owner, and let's go fix that problem. And that was sort of my first opportunity. I was managing larger teams before, but it was my first opportunity to manage a group that had, I remember it was a group of like, it was entirely, it's almost like a UN of cross-functional. It was like one data scientist, one data engineer, and then like one product person and an analyst. And so it was something like that at the beginning. And so we fixed that problem, we created a bigger solution, and this teams grew. And then I eventually ended up leading larger cross-functional teams. And that was an incredible experience from a leadership perspective, from the perspective of like where that put me in my career. And like, and now it gave me an opportunity to do the job that I'm doing right now that I really, really enjoy, and that has that component of single threaded ownership over like a larger part of the marketing organization that I'm now a part of.
Super cool that you mentioned that. And that's pretty unique about Amazon, is this concept of single threaded leaders or single threaded owners, right? Just for the listeners that aren't aware, I mean, you described it pretty well, but the way that I see this is like forgetting about the functions and start organizing or putting the org charts together based on like pain points or problems to be solved, right? So regardless of whether you're marketing, tech, product, or whatever, you're structured to solve a problem, basically. And that's super cool. It's very unique to Amazon. It's allowed for people like you and I to not have to wait until we're VPs or something to have these experiences, right? Because eventually everybody, like forward, if we fast forward in our careers, they all end up having roles like that, right? But they happen so much at the top. And what's unique about Amazon is this possibility of doing that when you're still relatively less tenured in your career, right? The point that you bring up is one that's very interesting, because I know a lot of non-technical people, and you were for a long time marketing, and so you could have easily been labeled as a marketing person, right? Although you did have probably a lot of other more analytical skill sets, but coming as a marketing or vendor management person, leading a team of engineers or data people, scientists, there's a lot of people who want to do that. They're not technical, they want to lead technical teams. There's also a lot of technical listeners right now who fear that they ever get somebody, a manager who's non-technical, right? So it kind of like goes both ways. What's your recipe for success there? Let's imagine there's a technical, non-technical employee-manager relationship, whatever way around it is. From your experience, like how does those work? What's a good sort of like common or best practices that you suggest people to follow in that sense?
As you probably know, there's not like a magic formula for any of these things, and I actually think there's a lot of ways in which that could go wrong. But as in any good leadership trait, it all starts with empathy, with sort of understanding what each person needs to be successful in what they try to do, under the obvious assumption that if they're successful, the team's going to be successful and everyone's going to be successful, right? And so, like, for me, it was all about understanding, like, where is it that I can add value and where is it that I can't. And I was lucky that in most of the cases, and obviously that equation of like where these people need versus like where I can add value is it's sort of very specific to specific individuals. And I felt like I was lucky enough to work with technical folks for which the set of things that they needed to be successful for a large part were things that I was able to provide. And so it could have gone wrong because it could have been that, like, you know, if I were to work with a bunch of folks that needed a lot of sort of technical handholding, or like that what they needed was to hold somebody to go super, super deep into the type of modeling approaches that they use, maybe that wouldn't have worked. I was lucky enough to find myself in situations where the things that they needed were things that I was able to provide, but I was very intentional about it. And in most cases, what I would say on is, it was really around 3 or 4 things. Like, I think, and I actually think this is quite common. These things are common, especially for scientists and data engineers. One of them that is quite important is success criteria, and like thinking very deeply about what makes a data science model successful and what makes a system successful, which seems obvious at the top. And when you're actually not super technical, you might think that's an easy question. It's actually a very complicated question. And it is a question that, like, most technical folks actually need help with. Because in a lot of cases, especially on the science side, there's sort of a tendency to do a lot of research, to do a lot of open-ended research, and people can get really lost in sort of experimenting with different approaches and trying kind of different things. And when you don't have a really, really strong notion of what makes this successful, that is obviously tied to business outcomes, then it's actually much harder for them to do their jobs. And so I sort of focused a lot on that. And how do you help them with those type of things? The second thing is really a little bit more open-ended, but it is really about like removing blocker, right? Technical folks in our cases, like, are really, really passionate about doing technical work, to actually go and code and like, and going and solving really, really specific problems. And it is very common that things like sort of how do we deal with specific stakeholders, like how do we are thoughtful about resource allocations, how do we deal with shifting priorities, are things that get in the way of them doing really, really good work. And so I always thought of myself as like the home blocker in chief or the linebacker. Like, I was like, I always thought that I would bring a lot of value to the team by being able to sort of unblock them and remove blockers from the things that that get in their way, so then doing the best possible job. And I would think that was really, really valuable to them. And then I think I also lean on something that at the point in my career where I started doing this, I felt like I was really strong in, which is not specific to technical teams, but is really valuable as a leader, which is just double down on your leadership skill, like double down on your career coaching and like career planning and thinking through strengths and opportunities. And I was lucky enough to find that was really, really valuable for the folks that I was working with. And then in most of the cases, like being able to provide really, really good advice to folks was something that I was able to do without actually being sort of at their level of technical expertise, and that they always sort of appreciated. And so those I think were the 3 things that I found that empowered me to do a good job with these things.
Super interesting. And I want to make sure to recap those. So the first one you mentioned is like the success criteria, having very clear, having a lot of clarity on what that is for the employee and for the project in general. Correct?
Yeah, correct.
The second one was, I'll call it unblocker in chief. And the third one is, and just to make sure that I understood this correctly, but doubling down on your skill sets and what you bring as the non-technical person, right? I think that's extremely valuable because, I mean, I'm a non-technical quote unquote person as well, although I've worked with a lot of technical teams and I've led technical teams as well. And you always kind of like have this imposter syndrome almost, like, hey, what am I doing here? These people are talking almost another language, right? But the way that I interpreted your third point is almost like, don't forget about what you're bringing to the table, right? For some technical people, a lot of the things that non-technical people do, like negotiation and blocking, kind of like on the softer skill side of things, those are almost like another language as well. So obviously there's exceptions, and I don't want to stereotype anybody, right? But I think that the concept here, and you said it at the beginning of the conversation, right? Left brain, right brain, all of this, obviously you cannot really pigeonhole everybody, but they tend to be stereotypes for a reason, right? So how you really build, and I mean, I know that we're probably going to talk a lot about DEI topics I have some questions about Latinos at Amazon, but I know that we're probably going to get there. But there's this concept of diversity of thought, right? So that's super interesting. And I just wanted to caveat that because I do think that it's easy to forget about what you're bringing to the table, but doubling down on that, or just becoming really good at that, or focusing on doubling down on those skills that you bring, I think is also really valuable. So yeah, thanks for that answer. I think the concept of single-threaded leader and the concept of how to be a good non-technical leader for technical folks is also really important. I wanted to pivot a little bit to my second question. And when I was preparing for this interview and I was looking at your LinkedIn, and I remember, obviously, we knew each other from back at Amazon, it always stood out to me how many extracurricular activities you had. And this comes from somebody who also had extracurricular activities. And there's a lot of these people at Amazon, right? There's people who invent all of these programs and nobody really asks them to do anything, and they do them anyway. You led Latinos at Amazon. You launched an internal podcast. What drives a person like you? Very busy, full-time job. You just mentioned some of the intricacies of leading non-technical teams and kind of like switching jobs, and all of that is just like, that's the entirety of your bucket, right? Your bucket is full. You then take the initiative of doing things that nobody asks you to do, right? Tell me a little bit more about that. Like, how can you recommend some of our listeners here? Or what really drives somebody like you to take over these challenges on top of the challenges that you're getting paid to do?
Yeah, I didn't have enough work. So Amazon is super relaxed. And so I was like, I found myself with 6 hours during the day. No, that was, it's a really interesting question. And it's one of those cases that are weird because, like, on hindsight, you're like, well, what were you doing? Like, why are you adding more to your plate? You have kids. And so, but I do think it's a good answer. And they're different for both of those examples. And albeit they come from different places. And so the case of the podcast was actually quite interesting in that, like, anybody can relate to the idea, like, in order for you to sort of continue to get better as a leader and as a professional, you need to sort of continue on that learning path, right? Like, you need to sort of continue to enrich yourself with new information, new approaches, and all of that. And I think I realized through a lot of experiences that, like, it might seem obvious, but like people learn in different ways. So like, I think about you, for example, you're a reader, like you just know so much about like personal productivity and the way you organize yourself, and you go super deep into your curiosity to sort of learn more about these things, essentially consuming content. I actually realized relatively early in my career that I'm not that guy. And that's not the best way for me to learn. Like, I actually learn much more by talking to people, by sort of like doing these things. It's like learning from people's experiences directly. And it was one of those things that it was like right moment at the right time. Like, we were working on a specific project around how to get better at like creating a better atmosphere for our broader marketing organization in the team that I was in. And the idea came up of like, okay, like, how do we explain better what it is to do marketing at Amazon? Which is kind of unique because of some of the same things that we were talking about, right? It's very like tech analytics-oriented marketing, which is sometimes very different from what people are used to in marketing. And we wanted to sort of tell that story, and we thought that the best way to tell that story is to talking to people who have succeeded at doing that. And I kind of raised my hand because for me, it was like, okay, like this is a way in which I'm going to learn a ton, force myself to learn a ton, in a relatively structured way, right? Like, now you're doing it with this podcast. It's like, okay, I want to launch a podcast every week or every other week. And so it sort of forces this rhythm of learning, at least for me specifically. And at the same time, it serves this bigger purpose for Amazon to sort of create content that would make it exciting for people to be at Amazon. So it gave me that amazing opportunity. I got the chance to sort of meet people, marketing leaders from across. You imagine like Amazon has a lot of different marketing organizations that are doing very different things, even though they're all marketing managers. And so you sort of get a chance to go through like a lot of different disciplines and different problem spaces of what people are doing. And so I think it achieved the purpose of creating a better community. But then for me, more selfishly, it gave me that opportunity to learn a ton and to force myself to learn. And that was just like a really, really lucky experience.
So refreshing the way that I interpret your answer, because Tyler and I had the opportunity to talk a couple of episodes ago when he interviewed me, and he was just asking me like, hey, what would you do all of this and like teach others? Like nobody was asking you to do this. And the way that I answer to this is like, hey, I read a lot of books, but if I only read the books and then do nothing, then what am I reading the books for, right? And so my way of learning is learning by teaching, because when you teach, you get the interesting questions from the crowd, right? And I'm assuming the way that I understood your answer is like, you had to prepare for this podcast interviews, you had to read, and so there was a purpose, there was a due date, which I personally, as somebody who's obsessed about personal growth, I always tell people like the problem about personal growth and kind of like upskilling is that A, there's no deadline, there's no urgency, and B, there's no finish line. So you're never going to be done, check, I'm already upskilled. Like there's always going to be more. And the nuance is that the more that you learn, the more that you know that you have a lot left to do, right? The unknown unknowns become known unknowns, right? So it's super cool that actually the podcast that you launched inside of Amazon helped you to learn in public almost. It's almost like a very unselfish way of sharing your learning with more people and kind of like learning at scale and having a certain commitment. So yeah, kudos to you. I think
The,
that's
the
awesome.
commitment piece is the important one. Is like maybe I was like, I guess like perhaps not very intentionally or knowingly, like very influenced by some of your thinking of what you used to do there, of like helping people know how to make progress on things that are not urgent. And so for me, it was that like I needed to bang one out. Like I committed to Neil Lindsay. It was like the VP that we were doing this business. We're gonna bang one out at least once every month. So I just kind of had to do it, and it sort of it forces that blocking aside time for this. That like inevitably in any one of this was a great learning opportunity. And so I was just sort of lucky to have the chance to do that.
That's so amazing. So it became from, I guess, a nice to have, and then you committed it all the way to the CMO,
Right.
and then I guess it became became a must have.
Yeah, you can make it.
That's super amazing.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how about Latinos at Amazon? Like that is an official role. Like tell us a little bit about like the story there, and I'm sure you have some anecdotes as well.
Yeah, that came from a very different place and perhaps was much more planned or intentional. I'm an immigrant. I grew up in Venezuela. I was in Venezuela for the better part of my life. I decided to move here to sort of escape a lot of the situations that were happening in my country. And I came to a really good business school, and I had the opportunity to join Amazon. Back then and now, I've always felt massively lucky for the opportunities that I've had, and for finding myself in situations where it felt like I always had really good options. And so not just from more recently, but even like when I was growing up in Venezuela, I always sort of knew what the next step was. I had parents that sort of put me in the right places with the right advice. I knew the right people to do the things that you needed to do, so you could then apply to the right school and then get to MIT and do the things that I did. And so I would just like consistently felt really, really lucky with the opportunities that I had. But at the same time, I come from the country I come from. I interact with a lot of immigrants, and sort of like it's very easy to understand how like a lot of folks don't have that level of opportunity. And so I always had this knack for like doing something about that, and like that very personal, and like but it was very true for me. And then for a period of time at Amazon, I was like, okay, I'm gonna do something about this. And I remember like the first few things that we did was like there's a period of time where like your listenings might remember from the news that like we're very bad for Venezuela. There was like a couple of years where like we literally couldn't find medicines, and people were dying in hospitals because like there was just a shortage of everything. And it was like a really, really dire moment that was the outcome of how the regime has destroyed the country. And so I decided with my wife and a few other friends, like, okay, let's try to raise money. Let's just start with raising money. It's a very American thing that doesn't occur in my country, but like you're like, okay, let's get with that program. Let's raise money and send it to whatever NGO we feel closest to. So we did that, I think, like 3 years in a row. We did this sort of fundraisers, and they were good. And I think that they fill some of that gap. But I remember at some point realizing, sort of looking back at like the amount of money that we had raised, and it was like meaningful for the NGO that we were doing. But I distinctly remember feeling like that it wasn't enough, that it like from a scale perspective, it just didn't feel meaningful enough. And that's when it occurred to me that I was like already at that moment, I think at that moment, like Amazon was, I don't know, the third or the fourth largest employer in the world or in the country. And you very quickly, when you find yourself at that scale and looking at that, you sort of realize that there's like a lot of scale to influence, even from within Amazon. And again, like if it all comes from this idea of giving back to the communities that you're a part of and the parts of those communities that are not as lucky as you were, my reaction to that realization was just to say, like, if we can help Hispanics get better careers at Amazon, we're talking about impacting hundreds of thousands of people and the communities that are around them. So that's the sort of like level of scale that felt like more motivating to me. And I was already in contact with Latinos Alamos because some of the fundraising things that they help me do is wonderful people that are very, very dedicated. And I got the opportunity to first be the secretary. That's something that you run for. And so like I ran for secretary and I started like helping with a lot of the strategy and the initiatives. And then after that, they asked me to stick around as president. So I did that for another couple of years. And I think a short story after that period of time, like I felt like that was a really good way to sort of find the purpose that I felt like I was missing. And at a scale that felt much more satisfying and motivating. And I look back and I'm very proud of what we were able to achieve through those years.
So great. So you had two big extracurricular activities. I don't know what the timelines look like or if they ever overlap, but I'm assuming that you had those two kind of like in tandem. One of them was all about you learning in public and sharing your learnings and learning at scale and putting deadlines to your own learning, but it was all kind of like towards that purpose. But then the second one, it was a very altruistic, I want to help, I want to give back type of approach, which now that you mentioned purpose, it's very interesting because I came up with this stat the other day. There's this whole trend nowadays where people feel, or there's an inclination of people wanting to have purpose at work. And so a lot of them actually quit or switch jobs or whatever, trying to find this purpose. And there's a lot of books that have been coming up lately. One of the best ones that I've read is The Good Enough Job, but they talk about how this is not necessarily true. And your job or your work is just one part of your life. And so they did some studies and actually purpose kind of like starts increasing when you start doing things that you love, but it kind of like starts declining when you reach the 20% of your time. Yeah. So if you wanted to optimize for something, have a job that pays you money and that you do well and you continue doing kind of like really well, that is tied to your scales and whatever, could have or could not have purpose, it doesn't matter. And then do something complementary 20% of your time that brings you this purpose, and then you're good, you're balanced. Instead of just thinking that you need to drop everything and go create an NGO, for instance, to help Latino communities, which could have been an option for you, right? So it's really refreshing.
Also true that like there are people that find that purpose at work because what they're doing on a daily basis is that it keeps them done. And I have some of those opportunities. There's always true. And you're right. You can react to that by being like, okay, I'm going to leave this and then do the other thing. That would be quite drastic. And it might work for some folks. It probably would not work for me. But I think what you say about like, you find those niches and you're intentional about them. And if you're intentional about it, I think you can find a balance that really works. And then to go back to what you always write about in terms of like how to time manage, that was a tailwind for me too, because now this thing that was purpose, even though it wasn't part of my day job, it was part of my Amazon sort of dynamic. And so one thing that I started to do relatively quickly when I started Latinos Amazon, we'd never done before, we started doing QBRs. So we started writing these documents on like, okay, how are our representation numbers looking? And like, what are we doing to fix them? And so that sort of felt so close to like my day to day that it kind of made it easier to organize yourself to make progress because it was kind of part of the same dynamics and similar mechanisms. And that also sort of made it a lot easier for me.
You were also there the single-threaded leader. So I guess those two big Amazon concepts of single-threaded leadership, mechanisms or setting up QBRs. Mm-hmm. I'm curious now that we talk about this, you guys had kind of like sponsors on the C-suite, right? If I remember correctly, you had Jeff Wilkie. Do you have any stories or any anecdotes of just having access to Amazon C-suite? I imagine must have been incredible.
That's another thing that I think that they did really, really well. It was sort of like, obviously, you'd have this sponsor, like there's a C-suite sponsored for each one of these ERGs. And so you have the opportunity to meet with them. And so that sort of unblocked things, but it also was like a bit of a way for the folks that were trying to do this to also get a lot out of like those interactions, which are obviously sort of super valuable. So like Jeff Wilkie was at the moment, but a lot of people thought it was like the second in command, essentially the guy that built Amazon's delivery infrastructure was for a while our executive sponsor. I think that he was really, really, really good. Like obviously this is like embodied a lot of the Amazon principles and the way that we operate. And so like we made a good partnership because we almost saw the path of like, how do we improve diversity as another business problem? And we would just like create QBRs, have discussions, have debates, and how do you unblock things? I wouldn't say it's as single threaded as it sounds, because like in that case, you actually don't manage a lot of the resources of what you can change, but it definitely gave us an opportunity to influence. The best anecdote I have from Jeff, which I actually really, really appreciated, is like, there was, your listeners will remember the George Floyd incident and like some of the months that like that and all the changes that very quickly felt like happened that year. That was also the year of the pandemic, and how things tend to move very drastically towards like taking diversity much more seriously. And so he sort of wanted to gather us to just talk. Like, let's hear you out. Like, let's talk about your experiences. I just want to like hear from you. And I think it was me. Yeah, I was the one that was like, like I think talking to me might help, but I actually don't think it's very interesting. Like, I'm a guy that like was like a middle upper class guy from Venezuela, came, went to MIT, and like had this job. I just didn't feel like I had the type of experiences that like minority communities in the United States have. And so we were kind of trying to find folk that like would bring that to the table. We did a little bit of that. And then we found this person that actually wasn't exactly like that type of experience, but somebody also from my country that was working at a fulfillment center. And he came to the table, like I told his story. And his story was around like immigrating to here. And then like, this is the next job that he could find. But back at home, he was like a finance manager. He had like a finance degree and like, I think a master's degree. He came to this country with nothing, and like he had the opportunity to sort of get this job in one of the fulfillment centers in the state of Washington, and it started still changed his life, and he was super, super thankful. So he was there just expressing gratitude. But when we got into this conversation, sort of like Jeff quickly realized, and we all realized, like, hey, like this guy can be taking a very different job, and you can imagine that even though that seems obvious, of like, okay, this guy's like this finance person working on an FC, he just have a different job. Large companies, perhaps unwillingly or without any intention, make that super hard to do. And there's also things that get in the way, and there's like, okay, do they recognize your title or your location or not? And so like, to give you a short story, like a month later, he had a finance manager job at the quarters. But not just that, like I think it triggered a lot of, and like a small project of like, okay, how do we make this easier? Like, how do we make upskilling easier? Because obviously, like in an employee population of hundreds of thousands of people that take jobs in fulfillment centers, there's a lot of people that are probably in that situation. And for us, it was really, really, really motivating. I felt like I wanted to talk to that guy every month, and it just made me feel really, really great about what we were doing. And like I said, it didn't stop there. There was like an intention then to sort of create processes so that like we could evaluate folks that have that opportunity. And that was really
such a cool story indeed. And it's you see it on the news all the time of people kind of like with such tremendous skill sets, but for whatever reasons, after that, we had it with people from Ukraine, for instance. They just have to take whatever job they can, but they're so qualified, right? I'm curious. You've been the leader between your time as treasurer and president. For a long period of time, you were a leader of an ERG. You mentioned ERG. ERG stands for Employee Resource Group. Latinos at Amazon is one of the big ones at Amazon. Amazon is one of the biggest companies in the world. So, you were the leader of one of the biggest ERGs in the world. How would you suggest people engaging with their respective, or maybe not even their own respective ERGs? Like I've read, for instance, that ERGs are a great solution for the deficit of mentorship that there is. I know for a fact a lot of people that request mentorship from myself tend to be Latinos. And it's curious because I never post anything about being Latino, but they just read my name and they know that I am Latino, right? So is this concept of people wanting advice from people who look like them or kind of like feel like them or share their same culture and experiences, but maybe it is mentorship, maybe it is something else. Like, how would you suggest our listeners engage with ERGs?
Really hard question, Jorge, harder than you would think. And like, I think your listeners probably have read news around like the current state of DEI efforts in a lot of institutions, and it's a hard time. And I feel that like feeling like I'm a part of that community, it's sort of tough to read some of those news. But it's also foolish not to think that, like that a lot of people voted for this, and that a lot of people actually have genuine backlash against some of the expansion of some of these programs. And it's foolish not to feel that it's also a moment to be also self-critical of like what works and what doesn't work when you're trying to kind of run an ERG, and what is it that's actually truly effective? I think I would ask, like, there's a perhaps polar opposite of a range of things that over time, like DEI efforts or ERGs have engaged in. From on the one hand, you might have like very sort of what some people might call activist-driven agendas that are very much like, we need to fix diversity, and diversity in itself needs to be fixed because there's something systemically wrong that needs to be fixed at all costs. And on the other extreme is like, we're here to make money, and to the extent that like diversity can help us make more money, then like we should do it, but if not, we shouldn't do it. And what I learned through all that problems is that like obviously sort of the more that you lean on the left side, like the more like what I think you might have not realized at the moment is that the more you sort of try to impose some of these ideas, the more risk there is and the more cost in terms of a backlash. What I found incredibly invigorating by working with an ERG, which is to go back to answering your question, is where I would like encourage people that are interested in ERGs or want to engage with ERGs focusing on is like, there are a number of very practical problems that companies really want to solve, regardless of whether they care about diversity or not, but that they want to solve. And that if you understand your community well, you know that it'll make a disproportionate impact on the communities that you're advocating for. And so some of the things are things that we talked about, that you just talked about, that we just talked about a second ago. So for example, like Amazon knows that like a well-mentored employee is an employee that is more likely to be successful, to develop into a powerful leader. And they want to create that mentorship. And I think that the reason why you hear a lot of like, when you get all these requests is because, as you know, mentorship has a lot to do with empathy and chemistry. And so it's actually not that easy to find a mentor. So you need to establish those connections, and like an ERG is a good conduit for creating some fluidity that allows you to actually more quickly find a mentorship. So ERGs as a catalyzer for finding people more mentors, like I think nobody is going to dispute that. Like I think that like you're not gonna have a backlash against that. Or as I mentioned, like, it's always numbers are public, but like if you compare the percentage of people who are in corporate roles that are Hispanic, even in Amazon, with the percentage of people on FC that are Hispanic at Amazon, obviously the proportion of FCs is super, super large. And so to the extent that you can create this path for people from FCs to take corporate roles, and now you're sort of, again, your community to get upskilled and to get better jobs, while fixing something that Amazon really wants to solve, right? Because for Amazon, it's like, okay, if I get hundreds of thousands of people on FCs, I can get a small portion of those folks to learn how to do software engineering. That's sort of a tailwind from a talent perspective. So we want to solve that problem. And in Latinos, that we went and partnered with a team that was trying to do that and sort of like help push a program that helped do that as well. Or even sort of in some cases is identifying those opportunities. So that would be my advice. Like as an ARD, go and try to find something that really matters to your community. Where that is like very clear overlap of problems that the company wants to solve. And then it's just about problem solving. You know what I mean? Like it's a sort of politics aside, ideology aside, we just need to solve this problem together. And if we solve it, I think we're both sides of that equations are going to be happy. And that's sort of like what I think I take forward from the perspective of like what I would expect to be a new phase of how you manage diversity in the future.
And that's kind of like trying to find a synergy between the left and the right, as you call it, right? It's like, that it is helping people out, but in a results-driven way.
Exactly.
Yes, I agree 100%. I think we're already at time. This has been, I think we could continue talking. It's also, I've been talking about Latino representation here. I hope the listeners who heard up until now, I mean, it's obvious that we both have Latino accents when we're speaking in English, but I think it's also so refreshing. I admire all of your drive and all of the impact that you had at Amazon. As you mentioned, like coming from Venezuela, I have lived a very similar experience, and it is difficult. I mean, no matter what anybody says, like it's very difficult just to come to a country that's not your own. Any last words of, you've talked to, I believe there's a lot of minority groups here. It's like the non-technical technicals and the Latinos and the people who actually want to leave their mark or want to find their purpose at work. We've talked to a lot of subgroups here. Any last words that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I love intersectionalities, like on DEI programs, for sure. No, listen, like I just want to congratulate you for like running with this. I read your content quite a bit, and I think one of the things that we talked about today is so important is this ambition for for self-learning and continue to develop yourself. And this feels like a great way of doing that and for offering all people sort of spaces so that they can sort of feed from the things that some other folk have experienced. And so I'm hoping that this can be helpful to a lot of folks, and I'll continue to be a dedicated listener moving forward.
So awesome. And at the bottom of this podcast, in the description, we'll add some of your socials so people can reach out to you. But I want to thank you a lot on behalf of everybody listening. It was a great conversation, and we hope we can have you again sometime in the future as well.
Thank you, Jorge.
Have a good one.